Okay, couple things. I posted lecture capture on speciation from the other section. I sent out an email, so watch it. I'm not going to have time to give it in class, but I gave it in the other class, and so watch it, and it should be okay. Let's see, and I'm doing the same thing with human evolution. And then I mentioned there's going to be 50 questions. Actually, there's going to be more, but there's going to be like 15 extra credit questions. Okay? And probably you'll get up to 10 extra credit on the test. Because we're behind and I don't want to, I want everybody to do okay. So don't freak out. Okay? Okay. Darwin and later Wallace had two great ideas. The first one was natural selection, evolution by natural selection, that we covered. And then we also covered the different forces that are involved in evolution besides natural selection. What's one of the other forces, anybody? Okay, drift, I hear. Mutation. Migration. Good. Non-random mating too, but that's good. Well, all those things cause evolution to happen. But there's another way, of course, that organisms get their traits they have that they need to survive and reproduce. And that is they inherit all of them from ancestors. Okay? In fact, that inheritance almost stops them from developing new traits because those old traits work so well, right? Okay. Now, speciation happens by the interruption of gene flow. So you have a population, some barrier, usually geographic, splits the population, they go on their separate ways. But in terms of a common ancestor, it's kind of like the same sort of thing as descending from your ancestors. You descended from your parents. They descended from their grandparent or your grandparent. Not only your parents, but your parents' brothers and sisters, right? So, in terms of a family tree, okay, it's not you're descended from great-grandfather to grandfather to father to you. This is our real family tree. Here's our great-grandparents, right? Kind of like up here. But there's all these relations between them, including second cousins. And then descended from that, there's grandparents, right? And cousins. And so here's your grandparents. You have 4 of them. You have 8 of them great-grandparents. And then, of course, your parents are descended from your grandparents along with their brothers and sisters. And then finally, there's your siblings, brothers and sisters, and you. And it turns out that you Each of these nodes is related by half, so you are related to your sibling, full siblings, by 50%. You share 50% of your genes with your siblings on average. You also share 50% with your parents. Okay? Now, if they're half siblings where you have, let's say, different fathers or different mothers, then you're 25% related. Okay? In terms of your cousins, your 0.5 times 0.5 is 2.5, but point times that is 0.125 is 1/8. And so you're actually related to your cousins by 1/8, first cousins. And you're actually related to your grandparents by 1/4. Okay? And then you can go down the line and see how much you're related. So the more closely you are more closely related to your immediate family than you are to cousins, grandparents, great-grandparents, all the way down. Okay. Same thing. In evolution, but instead of our individual cells, we're not talking species that have descended from other species. And, like yourselves, you might have a sister. Well, there's things called sister species that are more closely related to the species I'm talking about than they are to other species that are more distantly related. So, here we are, we're talking mammals here. Okay? And here's the common ancestor to all mammals. So, all the different mammals are related to each other. We share more characteristics with other mammals than we do with, let's say, fish or reptiles or really distant related plants. It's not like you descended from a fish. You descended from a group of fish, vertebrates, that then split into all these four-legged creatures once one of their ancestors evolved legs after living in a lagoon. Legs were helpful on land and all that. Okay, so here we have a common ancestor of all four-legged vertebrates, including amphibians, including mammals, including birds, including various reptiles. Okay? In fact, actually, birds are reptiles. We're reptiles, but birds specifically are more related to like crocodiles than they are to lizards and snakes. Okay. So why do family members resemble each other? Well, I just mentioned they resemble each other because they inherited more genes from their parents than they did from other human beings. Unless, of course, there was a milkman involved in the family, and then it might account for some non-resemblance. Also, sometimes you look more like one parent or the other. So does anybody look more like their father? Anybody? Okay. Anybody look more like their mother? Okay. Right. You might look more like some of your siblings than the other. Okay. So is the resemblance of relatives similar to the resemblance of species? What do you think? In other words, just think of your relatives. You resemble more to your parents than you do to your grandparents or your cousins or something like that.
Yeah.
So what about species? Do you think more recently species that have speciated more recently, are they more likely to resemble each other than some distant species?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's the same sort of thing. So both of these reasons, of course, they share similar genes. In other words, humans and dogs share a lot more genes that are similar or identical in terms of gene families than humans do and, let's say, amphibians. Okay? Now, the question is, why are neither the descendants of families or species identical? So, in terms of families, do we share 100% of our genes with anybody? No. In fact, we've inherited some genes from our father's mother, and some genes from our father's father, and also some genes from our mother's father. So, and all of those different chromosomal combinations can lead to all sorts of unique traits. And also, when there's sexual reproduction, you can get traits to spread, or genes to spread across a population quicker. Well, neither do species resemble exactly what species are. So descendant species usually look or act or have different alleles compared to their descendant species. They share many, many, many genes of their descendant species, but in the meantime, once they split off, the other forces of evolution have been working. Drift, mutation, selection, all that kind of stuff. Okay? So, even though species, or any taxa that share a most recent common ancestor, and this is what an ancestor is, are these nodes right here. Okay. There we go. Okay, so that's the most recent common ancestor from all mammals, and we share more genetic similarity with all other mammals than we do with, let's say, turtles. Even though we do share a lot of genes with turtles too. But the farther back in time you go, to more distant ancestors, the less genetic material you actually share. But all life on Earth shares the actual genetic code, which is DNA. Okay, so there's evidence to point to common ancestry. In the fossil record, you see certain groups of organisms found at certain times in the fossil record and not at other times. Okay? So, you would not expect to see a rabbit in the Devonian 400 million years ago because there were no mammals then at all. There were vertebrates, there were land vertebrates, the earliest land vertebrates, but they had not differentiated into all the different land vertebrates that there are, including reptiles and amphibians and birds and mammals. Okay. There's another thing. There's something called zoology. So anatomical similarities, developmental pathways, DNA, vestigial traits we'll talk about, and then you'd also expect to see transitional taxa. For example, feathered dinosaurs. And then where animals or where organisms are found on the earth, in what locations, and depending on where their ancestors were and then their descendants descended from, that's where you're going to find that. So look at these things. So this is a cladogram, and it shows the phylogeny, and all the phylogeny is just the evolutionary relationships among organisms. Okay? And it shows ancestor-descendant relationships through time. And then there's different characters that we would expect to show up at certain times in this phylogeny that corresponds to the fossil records. Okay? And we can actually map those traits on. So, for example, okay, so this is a cladogram. It's a phylogenetic tree. Oldest to youngest, right? So here we are up here. So before this spot right here, it says lungs. So before that, it was organisms without lungs. It was fish without lungs. Now, there is something called the lungfish, and it's usually found in areas where the ponds and water bodies that it's found in often dry out, and they have to actually survive with lungs instead of with gills to get oxygen. So we have lungs too. They're a little bit more sophisticated than the lungfish's lungs. But we suspect that the lungfish, that's the beginning of lungs, and they might get more complex over time. So, then we have, if we're looking at the phylogeny of tetrapods, a tetrapod are four-legged individuals, okay? They're four-legged vertebrates. They're always found on land except for the ones that have evolved and have lost their limbs and gone back to the ocean, like whales and porpoises and that sort of thing. Okay, they've lost their limbs, but they're still part of this vertebrate four-legged lineage, and we'll see why. Okay, so we have limbs, has now been mapped onto this phylogeny. All these species down here, they don't have them. All these up here, they do, except that they might have lost them at a certain time. Okay. Then there's something called an amniotic egg. Allows land vertebrates to actually lay eggs in drier areas instead of in a pond. And all these animals have amniotic egg. Here we have a mammal, and mammals have something that none of the other vertebrates have. They have hair or fur, and they have lactation. So, a frog or a salamander does not, because a frog and a salamander does not have a most recent common ancestor with a mammal, compared to mammals having a more recent common ancestor with the various reptiles. And then we can go down the line, fused bony carapace and skull below eye socket. So there's this group, that group, extensive changes, all of these individuals, determinate growth, hole in skull, that means all of these individuals, and finally S-shaped, and let's see, right. So you can see that all of these traits actually, there's a hierarchical pattern from less similar to more similar. And the more similar ones have a more recent common ancestor. And if we were to look at the fossil record, we would expect to find certain things at certain times in the fossil record. Like I said, we would not expect to find, let's say, that dog or something like it in the Devonian. Mammals didn't come around until 175 million years ago. Okay? So, here we have, we can predict where in the geological strata of fossils where we would find certain taxa. Okay? And so, we can see back in time, here's the ancestor of all vertebrates. Right here, we had jawless vertebrates. We had some extinct jawed fish called placoderms. They're gone now. We have, then came, with the jawless vertebrates, then later came the sharks and the rays. They didn't show up until about 500 million years ago. Then, let's see, sharks and rays right here, 550. Bony fish right here. Amphibians, just around the end of the Devonian. Then reptiles showed up a little bit later, 380 million years ago. Mammals showed up, it's a little old for that. But birds, reptiles showed up, of course, where is that? Right down here, okay. And then birds and crocodiles showed up, 180 million years ago or something, around that time. And then a lot of those, all those old kinds of creatures, they're all pretty much extinct. But there's still descendants that are living nowadays. There's still sharks, there's still rays, there's still mammals. There are some groups of animals that are gone forever, like those bony fish with the placoderms, or trilobites, which were an invertebrate like a horseshoe crab. They were living on Earth until 250 million years ago, and they had been living on Earth 250 million years before that. They're gone. Okay. So I talked about this hierarchical pattern, and so okay. So time again. Why isn't it working? Anyway, so older, younger, more recent, jawless fish, the same sort of thing. there's places where we're not exactly sure when things first started to arrive. Now, if we go over to here, remember how I was laying on the phylogeny different characters like limbs and lungs and all that kind of stuff? Well, here we are, similar sort of thing. The oldest are just vertebrates with a backbone. Then there's vertebrates with legs, 4 legs. Those are all the land vertebrates that we know about. Okay, including some lungfish, well, that's, no, fish. Then the 4 limbs. And then amniotic egg. And then for birds, feathers. Okay? So what you do is you expect this large one. This next thing is inside. The next 4 limbs is inside of that. Next, on amniotic eggs are inside of that. Only mammals and birds and reptiles, it doesn't show it, are in that. And then only birds have feathers and dinosaurs have feathers, but they're extinct. So we don't expect to see this. What we expect to see is something like this. This is another depiction of it. Birds are most recently derived. You go out a little bit and you have amniotic eggs. You have 4 limbs. You have lungs. Okay? So okay. Which first appeared in the fossil record? A backbone, a feathers, 4 limbs, amniotic egg. Which one? Huh? Backbone. Good. Okay, right here. Okay. Which taxa has a backbone? Do birds have backbones?
Yeah.
Do fish have backbones?
Yeah.
So they all have backbones.
Yeah.
Okay. Which have a 4-chambered heart? You don't know this, but mammals and birds do. Everything else doesn't. Okay? So a 4-chambered heart would only include the taxa, well, also crocodiles, but crocodiles and birds are closely related to each other. So you can see how things are nested within each other in a hierarchical pattern. So homology means traits that are similar because of shared common ancestry. If we look at these bones and limbs from tetrapods, these right there, I'll use a different color. Those are the phalanges. They've been modified by natural selection, okay? But they're the same bones. And they develop in the same way when these animals are developing as an embryo and then later on. Okay? So, the same thing with the carpals. Let's see, the humerus, what is it? I forget, I'm not good with that. Oh, here we go. Humerus, ulna are the red. Radius, no, that's the red. Ulna is right there. Carpals are those. Metacarpals are the yellow, and phalanges. Those are all similar because they were all descended they all came from a common ancestor that, in other words, the first tetrapod, that generally had all those bones and had arms that were and legs that were constructed in that way. Okay? So that's anatomical homology. You can also get developmental homology. These are embryos from the various tetrapods that we're looking at. These embryos have things like gill slits. Now, remember, we don't have gill slits. Birds don't have gill slits, but if you actually look at embryos of humans and birds and they're developing, at a certain point in development, they have gill slits. And then those gill slits are lost. Okay, kind of like when things showed up in the phylogenetic record. Okay, so another thing, homology, developmental homology. Fish, a tail. Reptiles, a tail. Birds, not really. And humans, not really. Okay? Now birds have feathers coming out of the last digit on their vertebral column, just like we have the bump right there. Okay. So this is all what's called homology. In other words, similarity in physiology, in development, in anatomy, the same developmental pathways from a common ancestor. You can also have homology, genetic homology. Okay, so if we look, we can see that species A and a close relative share more in common. Because remember, every time you see a change in color there, that's a change in nucleotide. Come on. Okay, so 3 and 30 is 10% or 90% similarity. In other words, all these ones that are black, they haven't changed at all. Only the red nucleotides have actually changed. So you can see which groups are more similar to each other. The distant relative is not as similar to species A as the close relative is. In terms of great apes, or actually primates, actually not all the primates, but most of them, squirrel monkeys, then you get to the great apes. So they have a large brain, no tail, reduced hairiness. It turns out gorillas are more closely related to humans because we have a more recent common ancestor than we do with orangutans. Our closest relatives, our sister group, are bonobos and chimpanzees. We share a most recent common ancestor. So that led off to them, and then this led off to all the humans in the human lineage. All those different, there's a whole bunch of species that have gone extinct. We are more similar to them than they are to let's say earlier monkeys or orangutans or anything like that. So when we say, we'll say it's incorrect to say that humans evolved from monkeys. I know a lot of people act like monkeys. Okay? Actually, that's not fair. I'm disparaging monkeys, and frankly, I think there's a lot of humans that do far worse. And how do you think a monkey feels being compared to a human? I mean, really. It's like, no, that's not me. We're civilized. You guys are crazy. Okay, so rather, monkeys and the great apes shared a common ancestor, I guess it was 28 million years ago. Oh, here it is. Okay. And so, let's see. These are our common primate ancestors. So squirrel monkeys are sister to all these other great apes. They're not, squirrel monkeys are more closely related to orangutans or gorillas. No. Squirrel monkeys are equally related to all of these great apes, including ourselves. Okay. Human chromosomes. Great apes have 24. Homologous pairs, in other words, 48 total. 28 from mom and 28 from dad. And we have 23 homologous pairs, or 46. What happened? Well, it's unlikely, first of all, one hypothesis could be that we lost a chromosome. But there's like thousands of genes on a chromosome. So we can pretty much toss that one out of hand. The only other way you could get there, unless just by some completely random chance, would be if two chromosomes fuse together. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. Human chromosome 2 has all the same genes that are on ape chromosome 12 and 13. Okay? So we can sequence those genes, the nucleotide sequences, and we see that, yes, the gene that was on 12 is now on this portion of human chromosome 2. Oh, shoot. Okay. And there's features about chromosomes that we'll get to later, like what's essential. So, this is a little thing on homology versus analogy. Now, homology means traits that are descended from a common ancestor, or traits inherited from a common ancestor. Convergent analogy, or what's called convergent evolution, is natural selection favoring certain traits that may look similar, but they're similar because of the organisms living in a similar environment, and not because they're inherited from a common ancestor, but they evolved independently. So we can see this. Okay. The ancestor had short legs. Okay? This ancestor still had short legs. These two had long legs, and so right here there was one change. The ancestor had long legs, and then it split into two separate species. That's homologous. That's a homology. Those long legs were inherited from a common ancestor. These are convergent. Here we have a long tail, and here we have a long tail. Everybody else has a short tail. Things started out short-tailed, but then independently later on for these two species, independently selected for a long tail, perhaps because of sexual selection, or better maneuverability, something like that. Okay? That's analogy. That's evolution by natural selection. That's not due to inheritance from the long tail from one common ancestor. If it was from a common ancestor, you'd only have one trait or one change, like right there. And so instead of long legs, it would be long tail in the ancestor, and then both inherited that. So homology is similar due to ancestry. Convergent evolution is independent origin from evolution by natural selection. Distinguishing homology from convergent evolution. So, what's homology again?
Similarity of traits from common ancestry.
Okay, so similar traits from common ancestry. Convergence, independent evolution of traits. Okay. So which of these is going to be homology and which is going to be convergent? Well, let's take a look. Here's a dolphin. And here's an ichthyosaur, which is a reptile. It descended from a reptile with 4 limbs, but then lived probably in a lagoon and slowly lost legs until it looks much more like a dolphin. It traveled in the same way as a dolphin. It ate similar things, I'm sure. But if you look, here's the ancestor. Here's marsupials. So these are mammals, right? This is marsupials. And then also placentals. Dolphins, primates and rodents are similar. Dolphins evolved, they lost their legs. Ichthyosaurs, they're a member of the reptile lineage. They're not closely related at all. So that evolved no loss of legs too. So the question is, are these guys, dolphins and ichthyosaurs, convergent evolution or homology? Huh? Are they closely related to each other? Huh? No? Okay, let's look at this other bit down here. These are genes that control development. Up on top is a fruit fly, and it's got all these different Hox genes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, we also have Hox genes. Fruit flies and humans are animals, but they're in totally different groups of animals. Okay? Our common ancestor was a long time ago, but all animals, it turns out, have inherited some Hox genes. In fact, they've inherited the similar colored ones. All the way down, right? Now, the only difference is fruit fly ancestors showed up hundreds of millions of years ago, and humans only showed up like 300,000. But humans are a lot more complex, and in those intervening years, more and more Hox genes were duplicated and took on new functions. And so now we have 13 Hox genes instead of 9 or 10. There are some animals that only have one Hox gene, like jellyfish. Okay. So, are those Hox genes inherited from a common ancestor?
Yes.
Yeah. Is no limbs, like legs and arms, inherited from a common ancestor? No. Okay? They both come from lineages that produce species that lost their limbs. So that's convergent. Okay. Vestigial traits are traits that at one time had a function but no longer do, but there's still remnants of those there. So here's a snake, a fossil of a snake, and you can actually see all these different bones. So the foot bone up here, right up there, the rib, there are all these different bones that you can actually see in the skeleton. Now, snakes don't have feet. They don't have legs. There are none of the lineage that lost all their limbs. In fact, actually, there are other reptiles called like legless reptiles that look just like snakes, but they're actually more related to lizards, even though lizards and snakes are very closely related. So what they do is they have the bones that show vestiges, or just little tiny bones that are left over from when their ancestors actually did have legs. Okay? Okay. Human tailbones. Now, I'm going to tell you something that's personal. I always felt like something's been missing in my life. And I didn't know what it was. A lot of people probably felt the same way. They thought, something's missing. What is it? Why don't I feel whole? Maybe if I fall in love, I'll feel whole. Nah, that doesn't do it. I went to therapy, all kinds of stuff to figure out what the hell's going on. Then I became an evolutionary biologist, and I realized I'm missing a tail. That is what would make me whole. Where has my tail gone? Just think how useful a tail is. Especially if you're a South American monkey with a prehensile tail where you can use it to grab onto things. I can come over here with my tail and you can shake my tail. Right? Okay? I might be walking along. Think about Donald Trump with a tail. And he might walk along and there's this really cute girl. I know this is sexist. And he uses his prehensile tail to lift up the dress. They're really useful. Now, you could also use them for all sorts of things. You could, if you had a prehensile tail that was strong enough, you could strangle someone with it. And there wouldn't be any fingerprints. Okay? So, that's what I'm missing. And it's a terrible thing. Actually, the genes for a longer tail, I still have them. They've been silenced, but I still have them because there are people who are born with tails. They're usually little tails, not worth much, certainly not something you could grab someone with, but they grow because that gene has somehow become unsilenced, and now they're producing a tail. They usually get it cut off before they even know it, and then they wonder why they feel half a person. Okay, same thing with goosebumps. We used to have hair, and we would use our erect hair to maybe scare other chimpanzees. And then finally, it turns out sometimes that gene for hair or fur has been silenced as well. That means it's expressing that now. And there are people like that werewolf. In fact, it's called werewolf syndrome. And it's kind of terrible. There are families where everyone's hairy as a werewolf. And unfortunately, they start acting like werewolves. It's terrible. Only with a full moon, but... Oh my God. What's that stuff that takes off hair? Cream, what cream is that? I guess Nair, that's right, oh boy. Yeah. Anyway, this is all vestigial traits, or what used to be traits that were useful that are no longer useful. They're still there because our ancestors had them. And then species subsequently lost them. Another example, why do humans choke? Well, first of all, whoever designed us was not a very good designer. But it turns out that our ancestor was a lungfish, and the original lungfish actually the entrance for the lung might have been the nose and not actually the mouth. But then it subsequently, those two pipes, the trachea and the esophagus, crossed, and things could go down the wrong way. And so there's this system that's designed to keep food going one way and not the other. It's called the epiglottis. And of course, sometimes it doesn't work. Ribeye down the wrong pipe, you're dead. It's a good ribeye and it's wasted. So the thing is, with humans, now other animals, where they cross, where the trachea and the esophagus, they're actually different, they're openings along a kind of a common pipe at different places. And so they don't suffer from what we do, where ours come together at exactly the same spot. And furthermore, it's because that our pharynx, which is our voice box, actually drops during development. And so, because of that, we're prone to choking. It's all, that's all because of evolutionary ancestry. You would think that, well, okay, how come evolution didn't get rid of it? Well, there's constraints on what evolution can actually accomplish. Okay. So here's a intermediate fossil or taxa between a fish-like ancestor and an amphibian-like ancestor. Okay? So this is called, what is it, that's Eutherian. This is called Tiktaalik. It showed up about 380,000 years ago. One of the first land vertebrates. Insects had already colonized the land earlier. The ancestor to this looked more like this fish, Okay. Okay, so the ancestor looks like more like a fish. It was a lobe-finned fish, and it might have been, or at least one of its relatives was probably a lungfish. This Tiktaalik, whatever it's called, you can see that its limbs, they're still more like flippers or like fins. But you could see they also might be useful in very shallow water, the interface between land and water. There are a bunch of other things that changed. First of all, the neck, it actually has a neck. Unlike fish, they don't have necks. It does have gills, and it's got a bunch of other things that kind of support a body out of water. Okay? So, another one was Antagstiga, another early tetrapod. Okay? So, this is a transitional taxa. It shows up in the fossil record exactly where you'd expect it. Below, in the older strata, there are none like it. There are fish, and fish-like ancestors. Above it, you see all the other vertebrate, four-limbed animals evolving over time. Okay, why do whales have lungs and hip bones? Darwin, he thought they have these characteristics because they were descended from a land mammal. He was right. So what do whales look like? Well, this is actually the lineage. That led to the whales. And it turns out the closest living relative to a whale and a porpoise or dolphin is a hippopotamus. And we know this because, first of all, we've got fossils that show these changes from legs changing more to flipper-like and then losing them altogether. And also, if we look at whales, a lot of them still have vestigial pelvis and leg bones and all that. So, you can see why these transitional taxa show up, because these lineages are evolving, and they're evolving because of the environment is changing. Maybe there are a whole bunch of places they can live that are not occupied by anything that does that kind of work that they do, or the things that they eat. Okay. So here's our cladogram again. And we've been going through this, but we'll start with this. So okay. They all have a vertebral column. They also all have four legs. A turtle is one of the major lineages of reptiles that include lizards and snakes on one side, turtles and tortoises, and then crocodiles and birds and dinosaurs. All of these are mammals, but they're different kinds of mammals. One of them is the platypus is an egg-laying mammal. Instead of giving live birth, it actually lays an egg like a chicken. Lives in Australia, called a monotreme. Monotremes showed up in the fossil record they were the first mammals. Kangaroos are marsupials. They have a pouch. So they give live birth, but it's basically to a little tiny embryo that then crawls out, crawls into the pouch, latches onto a nipple, drinks milk, and then finally develops in the pouch and then leaves. Platypus also has mammary glands, produces milk, and they all have hair. And then, of course, the beaver is a placental mammal like ourselves, where the embryo develops fairly, a fair amount, and then the rest of the development happens outside, but they still have milk the mother feeds, okay? So, right here is some point in time where there was a common ancestor for all of these groups. So, we'll say right here, hair and mammary glands. The vertebral column was there. And now we've got the turtle, which is a reptile. It doesn't have mammary glands and hair. The platypus, kangaroo, and beaver all do. So, then, where's the next chain? Okay, so here we are mammals, Prototheria. There's a platypus, hair, mammary glands. Then there are therian mammals, including kangaroos, Metatheria, and Eutheria, and placental mammals. And they have live-bearing young. They have a pouch right there. And then, hold on. This is a phylogeny of all life. It's from using RNA, which is much like single-stranded DNA. So all life shares the same genetic code. RNA sequences revealed that prokaryotes, in other words, archaea and bacteria, are two different, very different groups, and that bacteria and archaea, and that it suggests that archaea, which are single cells with no nucleus like bacteria, share more recent ancestor with eukaryotes than they do with bacteria. So it looks like bacteria is sister to the clade that includes archaea and eukarya.
And not just like specifically these, just from all the chapters, because at the end of every section there's like a few questions.
Do you want to know if you have the right answer?
Yeah,
Um,
because it's like 1D and
so this is question 1. Um, hold on. Oh, I don't think, I don't know if there is, if you can Google it, but you should be able to figure that out,
yeah,
okay?
but not just for these, like for all
Yeah,
the ones, but
yeah.
I'll just put them into Google.
Let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. Um, oh, yeah. Okay. Is an absolute. 1D, 2C. Oh. Okay. So the answers are here. Oh, I don't know what 1D is. 1D. Oh. Which is a good hypothesis? Okay. So, which are testable? In other words, it'd be 1D or no. I'm not sure. Shit.
Yeah, I was just going through it and I was
Okay.
confused about it.
I don't know. Let me look at it now. Okay. Another way for organisms to get from one place to another is dispersal. It can be dispersal of gametes, like pollen. It can be seeds, so young, or it can be whole organisms moving around, or having some organisms help others inadvertently, like by dispersing their seeds. So if we look at this, we can see a bunch of frugivores. These are all animals that eat fruit, including a kind of monkey, a toucan, Clark's nutcracker, a bat. These are some seeds that disperse by wind. Another bird that eats fruit, a cassowary that eats fruit, a coconut that floats, a lizard, chameleon that's looking like it's eating fruit. The only plants that can move are triffids. It's about a movie, never mind. Okay, and then occasionally, 2 areas that were completely cut off from each other can sometimes join back together and allow dispersal between both areas. And a good example of that was the Great Interchange, the Great American Interchange between North and South America. North America and South America were separated by water before 3 million years. And then after that, the Panama, Isthmus of Panama, right here, developed and allowed North and South America, the animals, to go different ways. So we had South American animals going north, and we had North Americans going south. it was more of a asymmetrical, as it turns out. More North Americans that made it to South America stayed and continued to live and persist, whereas most South American animals, except for very few, actually made it. They made it into North America, but they went extinct. So, for example, the only South American animal, let's see, there's an opossum and an armadillo or armadillo-like creatures. So both of these did make it into North America and are still found today. But there are a lot of species like camels. We don't have any in North America anymore, but they went, and there's a whole bunch of different camel-like ancestors, including vicuna, llamas, that sort of thing. The pig family made it down there, peccaries. The horse family made it both ways. There were elephants in both areas, they're now extinct. Dogs and large cats. So down here there are jaguars and mountain lions, and there are different kinds of wolves and foxes. Okay, so I talked about convergent evolution. So when you have homology, you have characteristics, whether it's actual traits or similar or the same alleles that are inherited from a common ancestor. Convergent evolution, like the dolphin and the Ichthyosaurus, they're distantly related. They both have the same sort of body because that fusiform body helps them travel through water efficiently. And so fish have that body form as well. Those are all convergent traits. They evolved independently. It's not like they inherited from a common ancestor. So, for example, in North America, we have a cactus. North and South America. Oh, come on. Okay. In India, we have the succulent. And then in Africa, we have this euphorbia. These are all very, very, very different, unrelated plants, yet they all have similar form and that also similar function. They all live in very dry environments where water is limited, and so they have all these ways to actually store water and stop water from evaporating out. Another thing that I do want to point out is that this flower, well, we see these kinds of flowers bright red, and they also tend to smell like rotten carrion, and we often see these in many, many different unrelated plant species. These flowers are pollinated by different types of flies, like when you think about flies that lay their eggs on dung, animal dung or something like that, or in dead animal carrion, all that, and then their eggs hatch and the larvae eat and develop. Well, they're attracted to this flower because it smells like carrion. It's red and looks like, decomposing meat. They lay their eggs, but in the meantime, they're also picking up pollen from one of these and then moving on to one nearby. And so they're pollinating those flowers. they're actually being parasitized by the plant and that flower because their larvae do not grow where they lay them. They think those insects are being tricked into laying eggs where there's not dead meat and decaying meat. It's actually plant matter. And then there are a lot of nectivores, nectivorous birds that have similar features to get nectar from flowers. So in Hawaii, we have a honey creeper, and there's a bunch of different species. They have different shaped bills, and they pollinate different flowers, and the bills correspond with the flower shape. Let's see. In North and South America, we have hummingbirds. They hover, but they also have different shaped bills. This one is a long-tailed hummingbird. The long tail is actually for sexual selection. So it's also a nectivore and also has a bill that's useful for getting nectar. This is an African sunbird, found only in Africa. There's a bunch of different species. And it too is a nectivore. Doesn't hover, but it same kinds of bills. And then finally, there is this is not a bird, it's a hummingbird moth. It's sometimes mistaken for a bird, but it actually has a proboscis that it sticks into the flower, gets nectar, and then in the meantime collects pollen and pollinates. So all these different birds have a mutualism with plants pollinating their flowers. The flowers actually give them all nectar, and all these different birds have bills that help them harvest the nectar. All these bills were inherited independently. The hovering between hummingbirds and hummingbird moths, they obviously evolved independently as well. So convergent evolution. So what causes the origination and diversification of new taxa? Well, it turns out, in a sense, new forms can originate continuously. However, if a habitat is full up of all different kinds of species, these are resident species. We call them incumbents or niche residents, and they've been there a long time. They're adapted to their surroundings ecologically, okay? If an invader or an invasive species, some other species came along that had the same lifestyle, ate the same sorts of things, they would be fighting for the same resources. But the incumbent resident, the one that's already there, has an advantage for having evolved there. Whereas this invasive one that's coming in now is new, and it would probably lose out. So taxa that are previously there have an advantage. The only way you can get rid of something that's there is to be able to outcompete them or competitively displace them. And that can happen, but it's much more difficult. Now, the evolutionary potential, in other words, to evolve new taxa, new species, it's more, it happens more often when there's an area where there's lots of vacant niches. Now, a niche it can be the place where an organism is. It can be the environment. It could be we have lion hunting on a grassland in Africa. its niche is as a top predator eating these herbivores that their niche is eating grass and various shrubbery. Okay, those are kind of like their jobs. Well, if there's vacant niches, they can be filled, but if there's not, that means there's already an organism doing that. It's usually hard to unseat them, but there are vacant niches sometimes. And what happens when there are vacant niches is oftentimes you get an adaptive radiation where one lineage splits into very, very many because there's lots of different niches. And I'll give you examples. So after a mass extinction, well, almost everything's dead. There's ecological opportunity in colonizing new areas that don't have this taxa that's dispersing into this area, or what are called phenotypic innovation, like the evolution of feathers that allowed dinosaurs to actually fly, some, and those eventually evolved into what are modern birds. Okay. So, extinction and speciation. So we talked about the analogy of birth of offspring from their ancestors, their parents and grandparents and all that. And that's akin to speciation. So speciation is akin to birth. Then extinction of taxa is akin to the death of individuals, right? So let's say you have a cousin that died very young. Okay, so it was kind of cut off. He's no longer around. You have all these other relatives that are around. Some are dying off. But in species, we have the same sort of thing. So this is a dinosaur. And these two are dinosaurs. And remember, time goes from bottom to top. So these different dinosaurs all went extinct at various times. It looks like all the dinosaurs actually went extinct about 66 million years ago, but some dinosaur taxa went extinct previously. Okay? All these one taxa along the tip, these are still species and genuses and families of organisms that are still alive today. Okay. There have been some mass extinctions, and these are huge extinctions where almost all the living organisms on Earth have been killed. Now, since the beginning of basically multicellular organisms, there have been 5 mass extinctions. There's the Tertiary Cretaceous extinction. There's the Jurassic. There's a, oh, sorry, no, hold on. Here we go, let's go, it's the other way around. Okay, so, there's the Ordovician extinction, Ordovician Silurian. There was actually also an extinction here that set up the Cambrian. There's a Devonian Carboniferous mass extinction. The biggest one was the Permian Triaxid so that separated the Paleozoic versus the Mesozoic. And then finally there was a Tertiary Cretaceous that knocked off the dinosaurs. Okay, and that was 65 million years ago, or 66. So that's the big 5. You can see it on the graph down here as well. They have peaks. There's other extinctions that weren't as big. And there were also before and during the Proterozoic eon, most of the Earth's history, 4 billion years of it, let's say, there were also mass extinctions, I'm sure, but the only organisms, there were only a few multicellular organisms at the end of it. It was all pretty much bacteria and archaea. Oh, like trilobites were these horseshoe-like crabs. They lived in the seas for 270 million years, up until the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, 251 million years ago. So they lived longer than the dinosaurs, and yet they're gone now. So what happens is with a mass extinction, it partially resets the evolutionary clock. Okay, it kind of goes back in time so that there are many fewer organisms around. There's less competition. So the question is, do mass extinctions have a major impact on the forms of biodiversity that exist later, or are they just temporary reductions? Well, they actually completely can change biodiversity. Like I said, trilobites were one of the most common dominant organisms for 270 million years. Now, they're gone entirely. The dinosaurs went completely extinct. They showed up in the Triassic, and they lasted a couple hundred million years. And then a giant comet or asteroid came along and caused another extinction, and they're gone. And after that, some mammals survived, and mammals radiated or created a whole bunch of new species over millions of years, and that was an adaptive radiation. Oh, let's go back. Get to adaptive radiation in a second. So, a question, there was a lot of questions about what causes mass extinctions. And the one with the dinosaurs, people didn't really know. They thought it might be volcanism. They thought it might be changes in atmospheric chemistry. Who knows? But two geologists from Berkeley, a father and a son, Alvarez, they noticed that there was this element called iridium. Now, iridium is very rare on Earth, but it's fairly common in asteroids. And all around this layer of rock, from exactly 66 million years ago, there's a very thin layer of iridium layers. And this coincided with all the dinosaurs were wiped out. In other words, older strata had dinosaurs, newer strata had none. Okay? So they hypothesized that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Now, one of the things you might surmise if it was an asteroid, you might predict a number of different things. You might predict there's a crater somewhere. Unfortunately, craters don't last on Earth as well as they do on the Moon, because we have an atmosphere and erosion and water and all that. There's also things that happen when there's an asteroid impact. They create shock quartz and various kinds of minerals. And so, and also microtectites. So, and then There's also a global pulse that burned the terrestrial biosphere. You could expect that if it happened in the ocean and the Earth is 3/4 water, there might be a massive, an idea that perhaps there was a major tsunami, and you should be able to find evidence of that. And an influx of sulfur dioxide, and this extinction killed 60 to 80% of all species. Well, as it turns out, so here's the iridium layer, right? These are these other things that they predicted that they should be able to find, especially around the impact zone, but even further away, and all at that layer. And then finally, they actually did find a crater right around the Yucatan, actually. Let me get rid of that. Okay. And it was about 110 miles across. It was a very large crater. There was a massive tsunami. There are deposits, seafloor deposits, thousands of miles away into the North American continent. And then they recently drilled into this impact crater and determined how they had theorized how it would be made, why there's always an inner circle, it seems, when there's an asteroid impact of debris. And so that was done recently. So it looks very much like this asteroid, in fact, did kill. Now, we would have to go back in time, but all these things add up. One of these things, like finding a crater, an impact crater, well, that's one thing, but that doesn't tell you anything. Who knows if it was in that impact crater? But all of these things, the iridium layer, the impact crater, these kinds of impact elements like quartz and stuff, the debris field, the tsunami, all happening at the same time, and finding evidence of that, it becomes less and less likely that it was some other cause, and more likely that it was actually an asteroid impact. So, mass extinctions can actually set up what is called an adaptive radiation. So how do extinctions do this? How do they reshape what's called the biota, all the living organisms living at one time? Well, they clear the decks. They kill almost everything that's out there. There's only a few lucky survivors. Those survivors, whether they're plants or bacteria or various animals or different kinds of animals or algae, whatever, those survivors provide the seeds for generations of all these kinds of new species. So there's oftentimes low biodiversity following a mass extinction, and that low biodiversity may persist for millions of years. As the biota recovers, all these ecological opportunities in the form of different niches, predators and pollinators, and different plants making different ways of living, all these things become available, and any organism that is better adapted to that small niche will outcompete the others and then will persist. And if very few organisms are around and then suddenly all these things get better and better slowly over time, there will be more and more organisms, oftentimes from the same common ancestor, taking various niches. So, let's say predators on the plains of Africa Well, there's a number of different cat species. There's lions, they're the biggest. There's leopards. Lions are more often in open plains, savanna, and woodland. Leopards much more so in more woodlands and then denser forests. Lions can't haul things up into trees, well, but leopards can, like their kill. There's also cheetahs. Cheetahs are also in the savanna even more so than lions, and they run faster. And then there's smaller cats as well, that I won't go into. But there's all these different sizes that take advantage of different sized prey, and these are different niches. But they all evolved from an ancestral cat-like mammal. So, when that happens, when you get many, many new lineages or species that change in size and how they make a living and what they eat and all that, when that happens in a short period of time, sometimes millions of years, but still short geologically, that's called an adaptive radiation. So did the KT or the end Cretaceous extinction of the dinosaurs permit the adaptive radiation of mammals? Well, there were mammals, like I said, before, during the time of the dinosaurs. In fact, they showed up much earlier, but they didn't make up much of the biota. They were kind of overshadowed by all the dinosaurs. They were usually smaller. They could live in some places that perhaps dinosaurs couldn't, but they were not as common or diverse as what happened after the dinosaurs were killed off by the extinction. And then there was suddenly, over the next millions of years, this radiation of all the different mammals that we now see today, along with some that have since gone extinct. And there are many instances of convergent evolution when this happened as well. So, in Australia, there was a top carnivore. It was called the Tasmanian wolf. It looks like it did the same thing as the gray wolf. Gray wolves eat all kinds of herbivores like deer and elk and moose and all that. Tasmanian wolf is a marsupial, though. There aren't mammalian placental herbivores like deer and stuff in Australia, but there's the equivalent in terms of marsupials, like kangaroos and that sorts of thing. Kangaroos eat a lot of vegetation. They may not look like, a four-legged herbivore. They hop around, but they do the same sort of job that, let's say, a moose does. So it looks like Tasmanian wolves fed on large extinct game. A tree sloth in South America, and then a koala, another marsupial, in the forests of Australia. Let's see, a numbat, another marsupial, kind of a marsupial anteater, a placental anteater. An ocelot in the Americas, another small carnivore, a mid-sized, small-sized cat sort of thing in Australia. A possum in Australia, one of many, and a gray squirrel. Now, mind you, all these different pairs are completely unrelated to each other. They look similar. They are an example of convergent evolution because of similar niches that are available from similar environments. And then finally, a cottontail rabbit and bilby or bandicoot. So there was a massive adaptive radiation. All the different kinds of mammals then appeared. There were still some monotremes left over in Australia, but there were all the carnivores, the felines, the bears, otters, mustelids. There's all the herbivores. There's all the rodents. There's all these cetaceans like dolphins and whales and things like that. There's seals and sea lions. These are all mammals, and these all turned into many, many, many different species, all from a few common ancestors that survived the mass extinction. Okay, and then ecological opportunity. So this often happens when organisms reach an environment where they don't have any competition. A good example of this is the Hawaiian Islands. They're thousands of miles off the coast of basically Central America. They're really out in the middle of nowhere. They were created, and they are still created, by volcanic eruptions. So all the Hawaiian Islands were all volcanic eruptions. In other words, part of the plate underneath that went over these hot spots that then created these volcanic islands. There are a number of volcanic islands in the Hawaiian Islands that you can't see or that are completely flat, like Midway, thousands of miles to the west, is completely flat, not like any of the other Hawaiian Islands. And there's others that have been ground down so that they're now beneath the waves, and they're just seamounts. Okay, so when these islands are formed, there is no life on them. This is volcano, right? There's nothing that would survive. But over time, things manage to make it there. Perhaps they fly, like these moths down here. Perhaps, or these birds. These are the honey creepers. Or perhaps crickets. Or fruit flies, or they drift. Perhaps these plants. It turns out these are called silver sword plants. They look all kinds of different ways, and they live on all sorts of different habitats in Hawaii, from just straight out lava flows to dense forests. It turns out that the most recent common ancestor actually came from North America, called a tarweed. It's one of these little daisy-like flowers. There's lots of different tarweeds, but they all look the same. They all live in similar places. Okay? So why are there so many tarweeds that all look the same, but their descendants, silver swords, look such diversity? Well, first of all, the tarweeds came from the mainland where there's lots of competition. So they probably lose out. They're good at certain things, certain kind of lifestyle, and that's it. Also, as it turns out, and then the silver swords, the ancestor, got to Kauai or something like that. And then there's all these new habitats, and there wasn't any competition. But also something else happened. The the tarweeds have 7 chromosomes, 7 homologous chromosomes. The silver swords have either 13 or 14 chromosomes. In other words, there was a duplication event. And it looks like a lot of these duplicated chromosomes took on new functions, made new proteins that allowed them to colonize and live in many, many different kinds of habitats. So you get this kind of thing where you have, I'm sure there was only one event where a tarweed somehow floated all the way on rafting, it's called, all the way across the Pacific to the Hawaiian Islands, managed to survive, produce offspring, and then over many, many years, 30 different silver swords. There are now 30 different silver swords, all from this one species. The same thing happened with the honey creepers. All these different species. Now, there was also, by the way, as new islands came up, that provided new habitat. And so silver swords, they might have started, let's say the first one was on Kauai, which was one of the first volcanic islands, the oldest one now. And then after that, Oahu, a couple of million years later, well, there's a good possibility that at one point either seeds or plants floated over to that new island and established a new population, and those turned into new species, and so on. Well, that's exactly what happened with all these different groups. Hawaii was basically a wide open ecological opportunity, and all these species came from a single common ancestor that had all these opportunity for different niches and taking up different lifestyles and diets and all that. And so you have these trepanid honey creepers, these crickets. There's over 500 different kinds of fruit flies. These moths, I think they're moths, and you can actually see okay. So the oldest island I'm trying to think. I don't know. But anyway, oh, I think these are different species or something. I'm not sure what this is. Anyway, you can see they were island hopping. All these kinds of different organisms. Some did it better than others. The flying ones obviously better than all of them, like especially the fruit flies. Okay. And then finally, you can get an adaptive radiation if you get a new adaptation that is so new and it opens up such great niches that weren't able to be accessed before. So, we'll start with feathers. Okay, key innovations. So, when an adaptation starts out as one function and then is used for an additional function, kind of like the opposite of vestigial, it's called an exaptation. So it's an adaptation for one function that then evolves a new function in a new ecological context. So feathers initially evolved in dinosaurs for insulation, for display, and it wasn't only until about 150 million years ago that the first dinosaurs started to take to the air, and they were very small. They probably glided, but they had feathers, and they had feathers that helped in flight, which flight feathers are different. But they certainly used these feathers for perhaps like I said, insulation, right, for display. See all these different colored feathers? This one too. And then finally, this is actually a bird, or there were small flying dinosaurs from which birds actually evolved. So it actually had flight feathers and all that. This allowed birds to use the open niche, essentially, of the sky, of the atmosphere. In fact, some birds spend 99% of their time flying, actually, even though they even sleep flying. And plus, this allowed birds to escape predators, disperse long distances, take advantage of a three-dimensional landscape instead of just a two-dimensional landscape walking along the terrestrial environment. And so there were many different radiations of birds even during the dinosaur time, but birds are dinosaurs. And so what we have here is when the dinosaurs, all the other dinosaurs died from the mass extinction, there was a small group, or a couple of small groups, of birds that survived it. I think one was in South America that gave rise to almost all modern birds. Okay. There's actually a video that I'll post for this on how birds are dinosaurs. Okay, and then a question about how you get all this biodiversity. Okay, and then that's it. There's another video